Darwinian Evolution, The Third Way, Intelligent Design, and Creationism. With the first session, we are going to look at definitions. Following that, we will do Young Earth Creationism, then Old Earth Creationism, Cambrian Explosion and the Amphibian Evolution, Whale Evolution, Signature in the Cell, Flagellum Motor, Icons of Evolution, Common Arguments for Evolution, the Eye, Phylogenetic Tree, Butterflies, and Arguments against Design. But before we jump into this topic, let me first point out that bias is huge. One's starting presuppositions have a tremendous effect on how one looks at this subject, and we will see that over and over again. So let me state my bias up front. Not only am I a Christian, but I believe the Bible is inspired and without error. I'm also an old earth creationist, and like many in that category, also prescribe to intelligent design. So I'm going to start with Darwinian evolution, these days known as Neo-Darwinism. Random mutations either enhance or detract from a species' ability to survive in a particular environment. Natural selection then acts, and the enhanced varieties survive and reproduce, as opposed to the less able variants. Phyletic gradualism, the idea that evolution generally occurs uniformly and by the steady and gradual transformation of whole lineages, called anagenesis. In this view, evolution is seen as generally smooth and continuous. Microevolution and macroevolution. You rarely hear Darwinists make a distinction between microevolution and macroevolution. In fact, some try to claim that the intelligent design crowd made up those terms, but that is not true. Microevolution is genetic variation that requires no statistically significant increase in functional information. Examples include variations of the peppered moth, Galapagos finchbeaks, new strains of flu viruses, antibiotic-resistant bacteria, and variations in stickleback armor. Each year, thousands of papers are published dealing with examples of microevolution/variation. These are usually the evidences given for evolution in general. I remember the pictures of horses getting bigger and stronger in my biology textbook. This kind of evolution, which I would call designed variation ability, is truly a fact. To see the scope of this, look at the variation achieved in dog breeding. This is not Darwinian natural selection, but you can observe the tremendous potential for variation in a species. It has been shown that Galapagos finchbeaks return to their original state once the weather patterns return to normal. Probably polar bears evolved from other bears. This would be an example of microevolution. No one disputes this kind of evolution. The assumption is that, given time, microevolution becomes macroevolution. Macroevolution is genetic change that requires a statistically significant increase in functional information. Macroevolution generally refers to evolution above the species level. Intelligent design proponent Michael Behe proposes above the genus level as well. The problem with the macroevolution assumption is that the evidence suggests otherwise. Our increasing understanding of microbiology is that the genetic variation in every species is only sufficient to allow for change in superficial features, and observed mutations which could potentially expand the range require altering an organism's basic architecture during development. But such mutations are always harmful, usually causing infertility or death. More on that topic in later sessions. The lack of evidence for macroevolution in the fossil record leads us to the next definition. As a consequence of the lack of support for phyletic gradualism in the fossil record, in 1972, paleontologists Niles Eldredge and Stephen Jay Gould published a landmark paper developing their theory and called it punctuated equilibria. Eldredge and Gould proposed that the degree of gradualism commonly attributed to Charles Darwin is virtually non-existent in the fossil record, and that stasis dominates the history of most fossil species. Punctuated equilibria, also called punctuated equilibrium, is a theory which proposes that once species appear in the fossil record, the population will become stable, showing little evolutionary change for most of its geological history. This state of little or no morphological change is called stasis. When significant evolutionary change occurs, the theory proposes that it is generally restricted to rare and geologically rapid events of branching speciation called cladogenesis. Cladogenesis is the process by which species splits into two distinct species rather than one species gradually transforming into another. Eldridge and Gould suggested punctuated equilibria as a general phenomenon, and I had assumed before I started studying evolution in depth that it was generally accepted, but it was never accepted within mainstream evolutionary biology. Many Darwinists rejected it, and others considered it as nothing but a minor wrinkle on the surface of neo-Darwinian theory. And now that I think about it, it is not surprising that most Darwinists rejected it, because it doesn't help their case. And just bringing it up admits that there is a lack of evidence in the fossil record for Darwinian gradualism. It is also important to understand what we think of as science. Science these days is usually regarded as naturalistic and materialistic. No supernatural or non-material allowed. We are so used to this, we just nod and say, sure. This has not always been the case, nor does it need to be. That's just what it usually is thought of these days. At least Richard C. Lewontin is honest about this initial bias. He says, our willingness to accept scientific claims that are against common sense is the key to an understanding of the real struggle between science and the supernatural. We take the side of science in spite of the patent absurdity of some of its constructs, in spite of its failure to fulfill many of its extravagant promises for health and life, in spite of the tolerance of the scientific community for unsubstantiated just-so stories, because we have a prior commitment, a commitment to materialism. It is not that the methods and institutions of science somehow compel us to accept a materialistic explanation of the phenomenal world, but, on the contrary, that we are forced by our a priori adherence to material causes to create an apparatus of investigation and a set of concepts that produced material explanations, no matter how counterintuitive, no matter how mystifying to the uninitiated. Moreover, that materialism is absolute, for we cannot allow a divine foot in the door. The eminent Kant scholar Louis Beck used to say that anyone who could believe in God could believe in anything. To appeal to an omnipotent deity is to allow that at any moment the regularities of nature may be ruptured, that miracles may happen. So my question is this. Suppose for a moment that God really did create the universe and everything in it. Could today's materialistic science see any evidence of it? The answer seems to be no. So here's the way it goes. Materialistic science starts out with the assumption of no God. As I've researched writings in evolution, it often comes down to the proof of evolution being that we are here, and evolution is the only scientific explanation. Therefore, we must have evolved. Then the circular logic is often completed with, since science proves that we evolved rather than were created, there is no God. In evolutionary biology, convergent evolution is the process whereby organisms, not closely related, not monophyletic, independently evolve similar traits as a result of having to adapt to similar environments or ecological niches. An example of convergent evolution is the similar nature of the flight/wings of insects, birds, pterosaurs, and bats. All four serve the same function and are similar in structure, but each evolved independently. A phylogenetic tree is a diagram showing the evolutionary interrelations of a group of organisms derived from a common ancestral form. The ancestor is the tree trunk. Organisms that have arisen from it are placed at the ends of the tree branches. The distance of one group from the other groups indicates the degree of relationship. That is, closely related groups are located on branches close to one another. Phylogenetic trees, although speculative, provide a convenient method for studying phylogenetic relationships. And now we move on to the third way. Currently, 72 people listed on their website. The vast majority of people believe that there are only two alternative ways to explain the origins of biological diversity. One way is creationism, that depends on intervention by a divine creator. That is clearly unscientific because it brings an arbitrary supernatural force into the evolution process. The commonly accepted alternative is neo-Darwinism, which is clearly naturalistic science but ignores much contemporary molecular evidence and invokes a set of unsupported assumptions about the accidental nature of hereditary variation. Neo-Darwinism ignores important rapid evolutionary processes such as symbiogenesis, horizontal DNA transfer, action of mobile DNA, and epigenetic modifications. Moreover, some neo-Darwinists have elevated natural selection into a unique creative force that solves all the difficult evolutionary problems without a real empirical basis. Many scientists today see the need for a deeper and more complete exploration of all aspects of the evolutionary process. Even today, the general public and many scientists are not aware of decades of research in evolutionary science, molecular biology, and genome sequencing, which provide alternative answers to how novel organisms have originated in the long history of life on Earth. This website is dedicated to making the results of that research available and to offering a forum to expose novel scientific thinking about the evolutionary process. The DNA record does not support the assertion that small random mutations are the main source of new and useful variations. We now know that the many different processes of variation involve well-regulated cell action on DNA molecules. Genomes merge, shrink, and grow, acquire new DNA components, and modify their structures by well-documented cellular and biochemical processes. Most of the scientists referenced on this website have come to a wide range of conclusions about different aspects of evolutionary change. Many see evolution as a complex process with distinct mechanisms and stages, rather than a phenomenon explainable by a small number of principles. The divergencies and multiplicity of ideas, opinions, and theories on this website are necessary since many fields of evolutionary biology remain relatively unexplored. The late Lynn Margulis, whose name was listed on the Third Way website before she passed away, and her books still are, said this: "But many biologists claim they know for sure that random mutation, purposeless chance, is the source of inherited variation that generates new species of life, and that life evolved in a single common trunk, dichotomously branching phylogenetic tree pattern. No, I say. Then how did one species evolve into another? This profound research question is assiduously undermined by the hegemony of those who flaunt their correct solution. Especially dogmatic are those molecular modelers of the tree of life who, ignorant of alternative topologies such as Webb's, don't study ancestors. Victims of a Whiteheadian fallacy of misplaced concreteness, they correlate computer code with names given by authorities to organisms they never see. Our zealous research, ever faithful to the God who dwells in the details, openly challenges such dogmatic certainty. This is science." She also wrote in a Discovery magazine interview, "This is the issue that I have with neo-Darwinists. They teach that what is generating novelty is the accumulation of random mutations in DNA, in a direction set by natural selection. If you want bigger eggs, you keep selecting hens that are laying the biggest eggs, and you get bigger and bigger eggs. But you also get hens with defective feathers and wobbly legs. Natural selection eliminates and maybe maintains, but it doesn't create. Neo-Darwinists say that new species emerge when mutations occur and modify an organism. I was taught over and over again that the accumulation of random mutations led to evolutionary change, led to new species. I believed it until I looked for evidence." Then the interviewer asks, "Some of your criticisms of natural selection sound a lot like those of Michael Behe, one of the most famous proponents of intelligent design, and yet you have debated Behe. What is the difference between your views?" The critics, including the creationist critics, are right about their criticism. It's just that they have got nothing to offer but intelligent design or God did it. They have no alternatives that are scientific. And then in a book she co-authored entitled Acquiring Genomes, she wrote, "We agree that very few potential offspring ever survive to reproduce, and that populations do change through time, and that therefore natural selection is of critical importance to the evolutionary process. But this Darwinian claim to explain all of evolution is a popular half-truth, whose lack of expletive power is compensated for only by the religious ferocity of its rhetoric. Although random mutations influenced the course of evolution, their influence was mainly by loss, alteration, and refinement. One mutation confers resistance to malaria, but also makes happy blood cells into the deficient oxygen carriers of sickle cell anemics. Another converts a gorgeous newborn into a cystic fibrosis patient or a victim of early onset diabetes. One mutation causes a flighty, red-eyed fruit fly to fail to take wing. Never, however, did that one mutation make a wing, a fruit, a woody stem, or a claw appear. Mutations, in summary, tend to introduce sickness, death, or deficiencies. No evidence in the vast literature of heredity changes shows unambiguous evidence that random mutation itself, even with geological isolation of populations, leads to speciation. Then how do new species come into being? How do cauliflowers descend from tiny, wild Mediterranean cabbage-like plants, or pigs from wild boars? More on the Third Way itself. It has come to our attention that the Third Way website is wrongly being referenced by proponents of intelligent design and creationist ideas as support for their arguments. We intend to make it clear that the website and scientists listed on the website do not support or subscribe to any proposals that resort to inscrutable divine forces or supernatural intervention, whether they are called creationism, intelligent design, or anything else. Well, yeah, if a creationist says that, they are dismissed because of being unscientific, because they don't hold to the materialistic definition of science. But these are materialistic scientists, and as a consequence, they believe in evolution, just not neo-Darwinian evolution. They blow up the narrative that neo-Darwinian evolution is a fact, undisputed by scientists. But they can't be easily dismissed as being unscientific because they loudly declare that they are materialists, not creationists. And note that they are not in agreement with what the Third Way actually is, except that it's not neo-Darwinism and it's not creationism. I'd like to show a short video to introduce intelligent design.
First of all, people suggest that you are a creationist. What is the difference between intelligent design, the argument for intelligent design, and creationism?
Right. Well, creationism holds that it takes the Bible as the basis of the theory. So creationism is an interpretation or a deduction from religious authority, whereas intelligent design is an inference from biological and physical cosmological evidence. So the one starts from the data of the natural world, the other starts from Scripture. The other difference is that most creationists hold to a view that the Earth is very young. It was created maybe 10,000 years ago or something like that. ID itself is an age-neutral theory, but most of us hold the standard ancient dates for the universe and for life, so and planet Earth. So I'm an old Earth guy.
So the case that is generally made against intelligent design is the idea that it's not a scientific theory. So is intelligent design the idea that there was somebody, you don't actually say God, but something, there was some intelligent force that moved the universe, that created life on Earth, that was responsible, in your book, for the Cambrian explosion. How is this a scientific theory as opposed to just, as maybe Richard Dawkins would say, a God of the gaps argument?
Well, one of the things I did when I first set off to grad school, my story is that I encountered this information argument. One of the most extraordinary discoveries of 20th century biology is that at the foundation of life is information in a digital form. The DNA molecule stores information in a 4-character digital code. And this discovery of Watson and Crick in the 50s has, over time, created an impasse in both chemical evolutionary theory, which are the theories about the origin of the first life, and theories of biological evolution as well, which are theories about how you get new forms of life from pre-existing forms. Because to build anything in biology, you've got to have code, you've got to have information. So I became fascinated with that question and the possibility that the information at the foundation of life was actually an indicator of the activity of mind, of an intelligence. But to determine whether or not that argument could be formulated scientifically, I had to dig in a little deeper into how scientists go about reasoning about these origins questions, about events in the remote past. And oddly, one of the people most helpful to me in that was Charles Darwin himself, because in the 19th century, he and his mentor, Charles Lyell, the great geologist, developed a method for investigating historical scientific questions. And they had a principle of reasoning they called the vera causa principle, or the idea that if you want to explain an event in the remote past, you should posit an event or a cause which is known to have the powers to produce the effect in question. And as I began to think about that, I realized that it was possible to formulate a case for intelligent design in a strictly scientific manner, using the method of Lyell and Darwin, because as we think about the origin of information, the one thing we know is that it always arises from an intelligent source, whether we're talking about a hieroglyphic inscription or a paragraph in a book or information embedded in a radio signal. Whenever you find information, especially if it's in a digital or alphabetic form, you trace it back to its source, you always come to a mind, not a material process. So using the same scientific method of reasoning that Darwin used, I came to a different non-Darwinian conclusion, which was that there is evidence of intelligent design, not just what the Darwinians call apparent design in the history of life. So if our theory is unscientific, the Darwinian theory would be as well, but I think both are scientific. I just argue for one and critique the other.
Early on, as I was researching this, I watched a video of a prominent atheist describing his reason for not accepting intelligent design. His answer was to talk about all the pain and suffering in the world. A couple of things wrong with that argument. First, it's philosophical, not scientific. It's called the problem of pain, and we covered it in my Philosophy 101 class at the University of Washington. I even wrote a paper on it. Lots of good Christian arguments on that subject already, so anyone who wants to can delve into that, so I won't. The other issue is that it misses the point that intelligent design does not name or describe the designer. Nothing in intelligent design says the designer needs to have any certain personality. Some intelligent design people are young creationists, most are old earth creationists, and some are none of the above. An important thing to define in intelligent design theory is the concept of irreducible complexity. A system is irreducibly complex if there is no function for any system that is missing one part. That is, if all subsystems with one less part are functionless. Another definition is, an irreducibly complex evolutionary pathway is one that contains one or more unselected steps, that is, one or more necessary but unselected mutations. The degree of irreducible complexity is the number of unselected steps in the pathway. And then a final definition: a system performing a given basic function is irreducibly complex if it includes a set of well-matched, mutually interacting, non-arbitrary, individuated parts, such that each part in the set is indispensable to maintaining the system's basic, and therefore original, function. The set of these indispensable parts is known as the irreducible core of the system. I will talk about the two major divisions in Christianity over the creation days, the interpretation of the Hebrew word yom, and the age of the earth in the next two sessions. Basically, the word yom can be translated into a 24-hour period or a long period of time with a definite beginning and end. And interestingly enough, we have the same kind of situation with our word day. It can mean a 24-hour period, but we can also use it as in, back in Grandpa's day, they called automobiles horseless carriages. So obviously that was not just one day that happened, but a span of time that had a beginning and an end. These two major divisions are often called young earth creationism and old earth creationism. Ken Ham, the leading proponent of the young earth interpretation, says this: the clear teaching and the most natural reading of Genesis 1 through 11, indeed the whole Bible, is that 1. God created the universe in 6 literal, approximately 24-hour days about 6,000 years ago. A lot of different views come under the old earth tent, but I will focus on the day-age view, whose major proponent is Hugh Ross, who says, the day-age view considers the creation days as 6 sequential, non-overlapping, long time periods. Lastly, I will talk briefly about theistic evolution. Francis Collins describes theistic evolution as the position that evolution is real, but that it was set in motion by God, and characterizes it as accepting that evolution occurred as biologists describe it, but under the direction of God. Unfortunately, it has become the default mode of thinking for many Christians who have heard over and over again that evolution is true, but still believe in God. That is one of the reasons why I wanted to do this course. I believe it is not only bad theology, but bad science. It's bad science because, as we have seen and will continue to see, Neo-Darwinism is not as true as the anti-theists would like us to believe. Also, Neo-Darwinism has no need of a God to start things off. It's a bad theology because most of those that believe in theistic evolution don't hold to a literal Adam and Eve. This invalidates much of Scripture, including 1 Corinthians 15:22. For as in Adam all die, so in Christ shall all be made alive. For anyone who wants to explore this in depth, theistic evolution, a scientific, philosophical, and theological critique, would be a great resource. Okay, next two sessions we will tackle the two different views of creationism, starting with young Earth creationism.